Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Luca Sprues. Now, a couple months ago, the Queensland Air Museum hosted a helicopter day, which was a little event where we opened up a few of the helicopters, had a few joyrides. It was a great day out. And to celebrate that, I decided to do a little diorama for the day. And what better helicopter diorama could you do than recreating the opening scene from the TV series and movie MASH? Brilliant series. So in today's video and in the next couple, we're going to be having a look at building this diorama. So this will be a three-part series. In the first video, we're going to look at building the 1/72nd scale Italeri Bell Sioux, the famous fishbowl helicopter that was used by the MASH units in the Korean War. We're also going to be doing an Airfix Willys Jeep, which will be in the next video I'm planning. And then we'll do a little video on building the actual diorama and doing some of the figures. I'll stop talking and let's get straight into building the helicopter. So after giving all the parts the mandatory soak in warm soapy water to remove any oils and help the paint conform to the model, I then cut out and assembled the parts for the 6-cylinder engine. The details on this were very nice and I glued them together using some Revell Contactor Professional. After I'd assembled the engine, I then put together the cockpit. There were some nice details, including the rudder pedals, the control stick, some raised details on the instrument panels, and even a nice little throttle control. I then carefully cut the frames for the tail boom out, and then glued them together. The tail boom was a little bit fragile, but it fitted pretty well together, so it wasn't too difficult to assemble. After the main frame parts had been glued together, I then cut out the rear stabilizer, the little battery holder, and also another section of the frame and glued it to the aircraft. Once again, everything was pretty easy to do and surprisingly not that fiddly. I used some thin pieces of copper wire and super glued them into the interior parts to simulate some of the cables coming from the rudder pedals and also from the instruments. After I'd finished gluing in the copper wire, I set the cockpit aside to dry and painted the engine a thin coat of Tamiya XF1 flat black. After I'd painted the engine, I painted the tail boom assembly XF62 olive drab. Again, keeping the coat relatively thin and using a bit of water so that it would flow nicely along the tail boom structure. While I had the olive drab out, I also painted the rear wall of the cockpit and the outer frame for the front canopy section. I then painted the interior of the cockpit Tamiya XF1 flat white, before moving on to painting the tail boom a second coat of olive drab. The cockpit sections and engine received a second coat of their respective colours before I started to paint the finer details. I used a fine brush to apply a variety of colours onto the engine, the first coat being XF16 flat aluminium, which was painted onto the cylinder heads, onto the gearbox, and also on the cooling fan on the back of the engine. Some Tamiya X31 titanium gold was painted onto the exhaust system, and the cover for the air filter was painted in olive drab. Once the gold had dried, I used some Tamiya buff and also some Tamiya red brown to paint a rust-like colour onto the exhausts. The cockpit received another coat of Tamiya XF1 flat white, before I used a relatively large brush to apply some watered down flat black all over the engine. This was to darken the engine, highlight the details since the black flows into the cracks, and make the engine look a bit weathered. A third coat of olive drab was applied onto the tail boom before I got some masking tape out and cut it into some thin strips and wrapped it around the various filter pipes in the engine. This was based on some reference photos and I found that they had a lot of insulation wrapped around some of the various pipes and filters. So I decided to replicate this using the Tamiya masking tape cut into strips. I sanded away some of the paint and then glued the engine to the rear tail boom. It went in relatively easily. It was a little bit fiddly to line up some of the parts, but otherwise it was not too difficult. Following this, I then assembled the fuel tanks and attached the rear drive shaft to the tail rotor. After that, I then built the main rotor assembly. Those parts were a little bit fiddly to do, and I'd definitely advise you don't use too much glue and melt the rotor blades like I have on some of my older kits I did as a kid, but otherwise it's not too tricky to do. Another coat of olive drab was lightly applied over all of the tail boom parts as well as the front fuselage section, and an initial coat on the fuel tanks before I painted the insulation tape very carefully with a fine brush Tamiya XF9 tank hull red. It may have been easier to paint the engine components while they were on the sprue, but I found once assembled as a full unit the engine could act as a handle when you were painting the finer parts. I did another coat of olive drab on both the fuel tanks before gluing them into place. There was also a central frame that went around the engine that the fuel tank's attached to. It's relatively easy to assemble and the parts I found fitted okay. I then painted the fine details such as the instruments dials and the collective Tamiya XF1 flat black before painting the seats XF51 khaki drab. Some of the additional T-tails were painted XF7 flat red and XF2 flat white before a final coat of some of the main colours was applied and the cockpit was completed. I decided to try using some super glue to glue the cockpit in place, which was relatively successful, but I recommend just sticking to the Tamiya or the Revell Contactor Professional. I then cut out and assembled the skids for the helicopter before gluing them into place and then painting them Tamiya olive drab. I decided to glue on the machine gun mounts to the skids and convert them later on to look like they were the stretchers. I then painted the skids and stretchers in, you guessed it, Tamiya olive drab. I then carefully painted with a fine brush various colours onto the rotor assembly, including olive drab, flat black, and flat aluminium. A little bit of flat yellow was also painted onto the tips of the rotor blades once the main colours had been done. For this, I just carefully looked at reference photos to figure out what colour was what. While I had the flat aluminium out, I also painted some of the drive shaft systems for the rear rotor blade. A fine brush was used to paint the door frames in olive drab before I used a thin knife to cut some Tamiya masking tape and attach it onto the seats to make up for seat belts. Unfortunately, there wasn't the option to do a MASH helicopter out of the box, so I attempted to paint the words MASH on the side of the helicopter using a very fine brush. The result was okay, looking a little bit rough, but it would do. To apply the decals, I simply put the transfer paper in some water, and then once the decals come loose of the paper or sheet, I use a very fine brush to take them off and apply them onto the model. Sometimes I use a sharpened object such as a cocktail stick to move them around, and after I'm happy with where they are, I apply some Tamiya decal adhesive on top. Off camera, I also painted the beacon light and navigation lights using the Tamiya clear colours, and I painted some white and yellow markings onto the rotor blades. Other additions included a spare pilot from another kit, and two other figures that were wrapped in some tissue paper to create the casualties. The small windscreen on the stretcher was made out of a spare water bottle. And otherwise, that model was completed. I gotta say, I had a lot of fun building the Italeri Sioux. I personally think it's a brilliant little kit, and I think it really stands out because a lot of the details, such as the engine and all the framework, is all exposed, so it makes it feel a lot more rewarding to have all of your hard work still visible, whereas a lot of aircraft would have the engine actually covered up. So that's really nice about this kit. Otherwise, the parts fit really well together. It's surprisingly not as fiddly and fragile as I thought it would be at first. I was a little bit afraid, but I think the Sioux does give that kind of vibe of being very fragile and delicate when it's actually quite a tough thing. I would definitely recommend this kit to pretty much anyone. People who are just starting out with models, it may be a little bit tricky because obviously you need a bit of practice to get the transparent parts in place without fogging them up. And rotor blades on helicopters, if you apply too much glue, melt. I learnt that at a very young age when I tried to do a Westland Wessex, so you've just got to be a bit careful with that. But otherwise, it's not too difficult to do, and only slightly fiddly in some areas, and you get a really brilliant kit out of it. So yeah, definitely enjoyed doing that one. Unfortunately, we don't have any in stock at Tectonic Hobbies, where I happen to work, and who supported this video and where I got all my supplies from. But we've got them on back order, so they shouldn't be too far away, hopefully. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed this video, and I apologise for it being a little bit late. I did actually have it fully edited and ready to go about a week ago, and then something happened to the files, and I had to basically redo it all. So that's why it's a little bit late. But hopefully we'll be back up to speed now over this next week, and in the coming weeks I've got a lot more videos that are in the works, so looking forward to sharing them with you guys. So thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or other stuff, be sure to leave it down in the comment section below. And a shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons, who include Archie Palmer, J&K Jones, Emo, and Joe Moss. So until the next video, model on.